quick, what does Stardew Valley, Clash of Clans, COD Zombies, and Valheim all have in common? Wait, you've heard this one before? These are the games that inspired my robot survival game. I've been working on this game for 8 months now and making videos consistently about its development. But not everyone has time to watch every video I make, and I would argue my video making skills have greatly improved since the first few, so I wouldn't recommend people watch those anyways. So with the new year, I figured it would be a great time to do a recap of all the work I did last year, so everyone is caught up and I can reflect back on some of the decisions I made. For anyone who's new, I want to give some background on what my game is going to be. I wanted to make a survival game where your base is the most important part. In most survival games, your base is something you can easily leave behind and rebuild somewhere else, but I don't really like doing that. So I came up with an idea where you play as a robot controlled by a boy, and so the robot is tasked with defending the base so that the boy is safe, because if the base goes down, there'd be no one left to control you. There are plenty more details, but I'll get into that more later. So now that we're all on the same page, let's get started. Every survival game needs a main character, so that was the first thing I wanted to add. I started by getting the player movement working. I decided to use the Unity starter asset just so I could get some basic movement, jumping, camera control. I decided this asset would be best solely because it came with animations already working. But don't worry about it being an asset, I've already tweaked and changed it a ton to fit my game better. And sticking with the character, I created my first character model, and it looked rough. Like, just look how big his head is. But at least I got a few features right. Putting him into Unity was another struggle. Since this was my first character model, it was the first time I ever had to rig a model, and this took way too many attempts. But once I learned about Rigify, I got it to at least not break everything. And now that we have a character, it'd be nice to also have it run around an actual game world instead of the demo scene. My game currently takes place on an island, but it wasn't always like that. When I started, I followed Sebastian Lang's tutorials. Just a little side note, I actually accidentally called him Sebastian Stan in my first video, and I felt super bad about it. Anyways, his tutorials led me to make an infinite terrain that was way too small for the character and had way too many hills. Which is totally on me, not him. But this was the first major checkpoint for me that made me realize this game of mine was actually possible. So I kept at it. Right out the gate, I wanted to improve the player character and the terrain. So I made a texture shader to color the terrain better, and I made the infinite world just an island. I also made it way flatter. For the character, I shrunk his head and learned another Blender feature, shading smooth. Now the character doesn't look just like a golf ball. As much. And now, it's time for what you've all been waiting for. One of the most important features that almost every survival game has. Punching trees. Right as you wake up in a new world, it seems like you always have to punch a tree. So that was the first thing I wanted to bring to my game. So I made a spawner to randomly generate trees across the terrain. Then I had to make a way to punch them. This took some time since I'm new to 3D animations, but I figured out you could make an animation layer that only affected the top half of the body so I could make them run and punch. I also added animation events to activate a hitbox in sync with the animation. And since I was already adding animation, I figured I should just go ahead and add a few weapons too, these being the axe and the pickaxe. Now when you hit trees, they'll break, but trees aren't going to help you unless they drop something. So I added an item spawner that definitely worked first try. And this is where I ran into my first massive hurdle. There was nowhere to put these items once they were dropped. So I spent days watching tutorials and learning how to make a basic inventory system. Right now, all this does is pick up items and add them to a list, which is then displayed on some of the worst UI I have ever seen. You could say I had a lot left to do. So that's exactly what I did. I immediately redesigned the inventory UI and shifted all the code to use an array instead of a list. I did this because I'm more familiar with arrays and I wanted to make it possible to store an item at any spot in the inventory. I also added a carry capacity for each item, and now the inventory looks much better. I then made it possible to scroll through your inventory to change the item in your hand. Before, the axe and pickaxe had to be activated manually, but now it's actually functionable. But this was hard to use still, since you couldn't see what you were scrolling through. So I made a smaller version of the inventory that is always on the screen that shows you what index you're currently at. Now comes the worst part. Making it possible to drag and drop items. This was way harder than I expected it to be, and now I totally understand why so many games have item duplication glitches. I'm just going to give a quick summary of this since a deep dive would take way too long. Basically, when you click on an item, the code creates an identical item in memory and destroys the one that's in the inventory. Then when you move it to another spot, it checks a whole bunch of things, and if it can, it will store the new item in that new spot. Sounds fairly simple, but trust me when I say I can almost guarantee someone will find a problem with this once I release the first demo. But that's a future me problem. In the meantime, I improved the way you pick up items. Since the inventory is limited, I did not want every item you run across to be picked up, So I ran a poll asking how people prefer to pick up items, and the poll was relatively split. So I decided to find a nice blend between the two options. Now you can look at an item and press E to pick it up, or if the item is already in your inventory, you can just run over it and it'll pick it up automatically. This way your inventory is always full of the things you want, but you don't have to pick up each individual piece of wood. Moving on from that boring stuff, hitting trees currently feels very unsatisfying. The first way I tried to improve this was by adding a shaking effect to the tree once you hit them. This way you know exactly when your attacks hit. My first attempt at this actually led to one of the funniest bugs I've ever encountered. This kills me every time I see it. What's that? You wanted me to keep talking about the inventory? Well, lucky for you, I have to anyways for the crafting. I started by making a simple crafting window that, yes again, is ugly. You'll notice that's a trend. I live by the motto, make work now, make pretty later, because who cares if it looks good if it doesn't work? And I can guarantee my game will never have that problem. But despite that, you can now select the item you want to craft, and the recipe will show up, and as long as you have the required resources, you can craft it. This then cycles through your inventory and removes all the required resources, then adds the crafted item to the first open spot in your inventory. Okay, now that's enough of the inventory. It's time for something more fun, like farming. I started by making the worst patch of dirt you have ever seen, and then a decent looking gardening tool. And I made it so when you're holding the gardening tool and you look at the ground, you can create a dirt spot. Then if you look at the dirt spot and hit E, you'll be able to plant a carrot. But that's not all there is to farming. I then set up a growing mechanic. Basically, I made it so every type of plant can store the number of states it has, as well as the time it takes to get to the next state. It also holds the range for the number of items you harvest when they're done growing. This way you don't always get the same amount of items every single time. And since I set up planting this way, adding new plants will be super simple and very easy to customize. For now the carrot is the only plant I have, so you're gonna have to just trust me. I also added a way to water the plants. I created a bucket item that holds a certain number of uses before it's empty. When it is empty, you can go over to any water source and fill it back up. Watering the plants is going to be optional, but it does make them grow faster. So if you want to take the time to water them, you'll be rewarded. But if you're more of a hunter than a gatherer, you can just leave them and you can go explore and they'll still grow. And now, for one of the most requested features, I'm going to attempt a new model for the robot. This took me a lot of time and I still don't think it's perfect, but once I got it in the game, I thought it looked pretty good. And since I was focusing on making things look better, I thought this game could really use a pop-up for when you pick up items so that it's easier to keep track of them. I even made it so if you pick up multiple of the same item in a row, the pop-ups will just stack instead of making a new one every time. So besides the UI still looking terrible, it was working pretty good. So what better time than now to upgrade the UI? To start, I shrunk the inventory window and moved it to the center of the screen, and I made the crafting window expand out when you make selections so that it won't take up much room if you aren't using it. I also moved the hotbar to the bottom of the screen as I thought it felt better that way. Sticking with the inventory, I made a chest that can spawn across the island, and I made it so every chest will have a random amount of items in it already. This process took a bit of time to get working correctly, but it was boring, so moving on. Once it was done, I made it so you can craft one and place it anywhere. I then moved on to some more important survival features, the health bar and the energy bar. The health bar is pretty standard, but the energy bar is pretty cool. Yes, it's just a reskin stamina bar, but it fits the theme better as an energy bar. This bar will be decreasing at all times, and you'll use more of it when you do something like attack. But running will not decrease it, because any game that punishes the player for running is really annoying. Just keep an eye on this bar, because if it hits empty, you'll enter power saving mode, and while you can still run away, you'll be unable to attack. But don't worry, all hope isn't lost, for I have also made the first consumable, a battery. Please keep in mind batteries are not consumable in real life. But in this game, they'll restore some of your energy. Now you might be wondering, if we're out here eating batteries, why are we growing carrots? Well, that's because you're not just a robot. You're a boy controlling a robot, so the boy needs food too. I haven't finalized this mechanic by any means, but I made it so if you run up to your house and press E, a food inventory pops up. This inventory only lets you put in food. Right now it doesn't do anything, but I have some big ideas in mind. But that's getting ahead of myself. Instead, let's improve the environment. Right now, all the trees and rocks are randomly spread across the island, but this leads the whole island to feeling the same. So instead, I tweaked the spawning so that the trees will spawn across the map still, but they'll also spawn in dense forests around the map. And if you think that's the last thing I'm going to do with the environment, you'd be wrong. But I hate doing that stuff, so I decided to add the first enemy instead. I started with a little being with a very angry face. I gave it a simple movement script to move and look at the player. This works most of the time. Then I made a state machine so the enemy will patrol an area until it sees the player. I used a bunch of raycasts for detection, which is stupid, but it worked. Kinda. The only thing left to do was add a way to attack. I gave it a simple attack where it would lean back and then headbutt forward. As you can see, the red box is just so you can see the hitbox, and if you make contact with it, you take damage. Unless you dodge. I always have more fun with dodge rolls than I do shields, so I decided to add that first. Now you can have a few frames of invulnerability you can use instead of just attacking blindly. And now that we have the basics done for the enemy, it's time to give him a real model. I basically just made Karen from SpongeBob, but it works for now. I set up a new animation for the attack and gave him a little face so you can see what state he's in. But while testing this out, I found that the combat felt awful. It is partially to blame on the bad animations, but I found it hard to aim. To fix this, I made it so whenever you attack, your body will turn to look exactly where the camera is pointing. This way you always attack where you're looking instead of wherever you're moving, and this feels so much better. And now that we have the first enemy in the game, I can go back to improving the environment. I wanted to add grass to the terrain because I thought it would make a huge difference. This took me a ton of time, and I actually really liked the video I made about it, so I'll give you a quick summary, and if you really want the gritty details, you can go watch that after. Basically, I learned how to use GPU instancing because having every grass patch be a new game object made the game unplayable. Once I finally got that working, I still had to optimize a ton. The first thing I did was make the grass only show up if it was a certain distance from the player, so that grass across the map isn't taking up processing power. I then improved this even more by implementing chunking. If you're unfamiliar with chunking, just think of it as squares of grass that will only populate if the player is close enough to them. Minecraft does this with its entire world. And with all that added, the game can run. Still not very well, but 50 frames per second is way better than 2. And I think the grass really makes the game look better. I will be tweaking this more in the future, but there are plenty of other improvements I can work on right now, like adding a skybox. I just threw in a simple skybox and even that made a huge difference. This world is really coming together. But I can't think of a good segue for the next thing, so pretend I did something clever and brought up how I wanted to add the first base defense. In the very first video I made about this game, I mentioned that a scarecrow wouldn't just be a scarecrow, but instead be a scarecrow with a gun. And since I'm a man of my word, I wanted to actually make that happen. I started with this simple cube as a placeholder, and made it lock onto an enemy when it's within range. I made the range using a collider that adds the enemy to a list. It then finds the closest enemy and locks onto it. I ended up doing the same thing for the enemies detection since the original method was so bad, and now the enemies can lock onto the scarecrow as well. I also added a health bar that is always looking at you, just for some added quality of life. I then made a new resource for the enemy to drop, that being scrap metal, which I immediately used to craft bullets, and I made it so the scarecrow needs bullets in order to shoot. I then created the scarecrow model, which took a few attempts, and it still doesn't look quite right. But I also added a gun that would pop out of its head whenever an enemy was within range, and I thought this was pretty cool. Now all that was left was the ability to place it. I had made placement code before for the chest, but it was really bad, so I had to rework that too, and improved it a bunch. Now you can only place items when there aren't overlapping with others. Again, I actually liked the video I made about this, so go check it out if you want some more details. And that wraps up all the progress I made this year. Hopefully you enjoyed this recap. Compiling everything together was really fun and made me realize just how much I've gotten done this year, and I'm excited to keep it going next year. If you want to keep up to date with everything I add, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Happy New Year!